So what they do is they set their own standard for what foods are considered essentially healthy and can be advertised to kids. And while it is true that they have tightened that standard periodically over the years, I just looked at the current product list because I knew we'd be talking about it. And here's some examples: Lucky Charms, Trix, Pop-Tarts, Lunchables, Flavor Blasted Goldfish. Those are all considered healthy foods that still can be advertised to children. So I think most parents listening are thinking, well, thanks, but we haven't really made a tremendous amount of progress if that's the bar, the limit.
Welcome to the Wise Consumer Podcast, the answer to your eco-friendly and healthy lifestyle questions. How to reduce your exposure to harmful chemicals, whether or not it's normal to have a painful period, how to live an eco-friendly lifestyle on a budget, and more. With the help of experts, I'm talking scientists, toxicologists, endocrinologists, cosmetic chemists, you'll get knowledge and know-how to your most pressing health concerns and sustainability questions straight from the source. I'm Madeline Weisskopf, your host, confidant, and in-house science nerd, here on a mission to help empower, inspire, and support you in your own health and eco journey. Because, friend, I am a firm believer that if you don't feel good, you can't do good. So, pour yourself a cup of tea, kick off your shoes, take a deep breath, and let's get started. If I were to ask you to define kid food, i.e. foods you think kids eat and or like to eat, what items do you think would be on your list? Most likely, if you're anything like me, your kid food list probably consists of items such as pizza, chicken tenders, mac and cheese, fruit snacks, hot dogs, juice pouches, and others of that sort, right? Basically foods that are fun, highly processed, pre-packaged, and generally don't contain a lot of fiber. Of course, don't get me wrong. There is nothing wrong per se with kid food. I am not labeling these foods as good or bad, as I myself am an avid fan of kid food, but in moderation. The challenge today, unfortunately, is that more and more children and adolescents are obtaining most of their calories from these types of highly processed foods rather than minimally or unprocessed foods. In fact, according to a new study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the calories that children and adolescents consumed from ultra-processed foods that the study defines as ready-to-eat or ready-to-heat dishes, which often contain more sugar and salt and less fiber than unprocessed and minimally processed foods, jumped from 61% to 67% of total caloric intake from 1999 to 2018. In other words, this means that 2/3 of calories consumed by children and adolescents today are coming from, according to this report, ultra-processed foods. So why is this? As I started exploring this complex issue in more depth, because yes, this is a very complex, multi-layered issue with no simple solution, I came across a fascinating book by children's food advocate and nationally recognized writer Bettina Siegel called Kid Food: The Challenges of Feeding Children in a Highly Processed World. And you guys, I was hooked. This book for me was a page turner and opened my eyes to just how broken, and I hate saying this, but manipulative the food industry, more specifically the kid food industry, is when it comes to advertising to our children. This book, of course, covers a slew of other topics, from the challenges around food policy to helping readers better understand why our children's food environment is so unhealthy, and how to help parents navigate and push back against the food industry if we so desire to do so. If you're a parent or soon-to-be parent looking for tools, insight, and tips on how to feed your kids more healthfully in this highly processed world, or simply interested in food policy and nutrition, then you're going to love this conversation with Bettina Siegel. We're digging into the differences between highly processed versus minimally processed foods and why this matters, how kid food became, well, kid food, the history of the children's restaurant food menu, the complexities of the food advertising industry, how immersive and aggressive kid food marketing is impacting our children's nutritional choices and ultimately their health, greenwashing, food insecurity, and so much more. I have been following Bettina's work for quite some time now, and I am so eager to dive into all of this with you today. So, without further ado, let's get started. Well, Bettina, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Well, wonderful. Bettina, thank you so much for being on the Wise Consumer podcast. I cannot tell you how much I'm looking forward to this conversation, as this is actually a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And I'm really honored to have you to explore this and share this issue with my listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
As I mentioned, we have a lot of content to get through in a short amount of time. So we're just going to dive right in. And for anyone who isn't familiar with your story or the work you're doing, I would love for you to kind of share a little bit about the journey that led you here, how you went from being a lawyer to a children's food advocate.
I'll try to sum it up. I mean, not only was I a lawyer, I actually was a lawyer for big food. And then when we had our first child in 2000, I stopped practicing law altogether. And by the time my kids were around preschool, early elementary age, I decided to start exploring a career in freelance writing. I never intended to become a children's food advocate. That was not on my radar at all. But in 2010, I joined a committee in Houston ISD, which is where we live. My kids were in public school at that time. And this committee was being formed to try to improve our school meals. And this was before the Obama era reform. So our school meals were pretty bad, as was the case really all over the country. And I started learning so much in those meetings that really intrigued me. Some of it kind of angered me, but it was just a lot of information. I thought parents were upset about school food, but didn't really have the big picture. And I was starting to get the big picture and wanted to share it. And then just totally separate from that, I was then a mom of an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. And I was finding it very difficult to raise healthy eaters. I thought that wouldn't be a challenge. And in fact, it turned out to be kind of a big challenge. And so all of that kind of came together along with this, sort of fledgling writing career that I had. And I decided to start this blog called The Lunch Tray in 2010. And it was just supposed to be this kind of sideline while I was still doing magazine writing, but it really took off. It really found an audience. To my great pleasure, it wasn't just attracting parents, but also school food professionals, team, food thought leaders. And so that really became my trajectory. And then ultimately, I decided to write a book called Kid Food, which came out at the end of 2019. So that's kind of how I got from A to B.
I love it. And Kid Food is it's really been eye-opening. I felt like I knew a lot already. But then I realized how little I actually knew. And I want to talk about some of the issues that you write about in Kid Food. But what was it that kind of inspired you? You said you were at the time already exploring. You mentioned you were already exploring some of the bigger picture issues. What was it that made you, I guess, curious as to what were the bigger picture issues?
I think parents who care about raising healthy eaters feel like they're swimming upstream in so many different ways. What they see in the school cafeteria, the junk food that kids can get in the classroom when kids were in classrooms pre-COVID, it can come as a huge shock, I think, for a lot of parents, certainly in public school. It may be less the case in private school. The quality of snacks and drinks your kids are getting at soccer practice and in sports leagues, it's kind of coming at you from a lot of different avenues. And I did start to want to think about, like, what is the bigger picture here? What's driving this kind of deluge of ultra processed food, high sugar foods towards our kids in so many different contexts? And of course, the reasons are different in every different context. But I think after blogging at that point for 8 years, I really was in this kind of almost privileged position because I was hearing from food policy people, I was hearing from school food professionals, I was hearing from parents, and I started to feel like, you know what, I really am in this unique position where I can put this together for parents and try to give them that big picture, which hopefully will be useful to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, you're not only your blog, your Substack, which we'll talk about, but your book. I really, really highly recommend, especially as you said, for anyone who's like trying to understand how to feed healthy eaters. But you talk about the overall picture. And I want to start, I'm such a nerd about this, but I want to start with the history of kid food, because I was reading that and I was like, telling my husband, I was like, oh my gosh, did you know? And he was like, he stopped what he was doing. We were talking about this. So prior, you wrote in your book here, and I'm going to quote it. You write that in the past, restaurateurs had no desire to serve, quote, tyrants in short jackets and pinafores, meaning like restaurants weren't serving children back in the day. And yet you said the prohibition, which this is what I thought was like so interesting and my listeners will find interesting, is prohibition changed this. And I'm curious, how did the prohibition change this? And how did we, and what kind of menus were being served to children back in the day once they were allowed?
Well, I'm so glad you also are a food history nerd and enjoyed this because I found it fascinating. So I'm writing this book called Kid Food, and I'm trying to define kid food. And I became really curious about what is the history of kid food. So it seemed to me that restaurant children's menus might be a really good avenue because that kind of represents a snapshot at any given time of what our society thinks is appropriate for kids in restaurants. So I did dig into the history of the children's menu, and going into the research, I just would have assumed that whenever these menus appeared, and I didn't know when they did, that they would be offering kids kind of the equivalent of today's restaurant kid food, meaning like treats, food that is not super good for them, but delicious, because going out is kind of celebratory. And that's what I assumed. I would find kind of like today's equivalent of like the chicken nugget whenever they appeared. What I found out was it was completely the opposite. And just as you said, prohibition really played a role. So before prohibition, restaurants did not want kids around. They felt like it distracted from the kind of adult dining experience, maybe understandably. Once prohibition started, restaurants, of course, just as today, they make a ton of money from alcohol, and suddenly they lost that revenue. And competition in the industry got really intense because now bars were also serving food because they had no choice, right? So suddenly restaurants are very interested in attracting families just as a revenue source. And what was going on at the time, just to give you a little background, is moms of that period were just starting to get a lot of information about nutrition, proper childhood nutrition, home economics. This was like sort of new information coming at moms in the early 1900s. And so they might want to take their kids to a restaurant, but they are fearful that the food in the restaurant isn't appropriate for their kid. And so around this time, I attribute it in part to this female journalist named Ethel Colson, who wrote this article in a restaurant trade journal saying, why not children's luncheon? And so she's saying to restaurants, listen, if you want to attract this new health conscious mom and her child, you need to be creating a special menu for kids that's especially healthy. So it's literally the exact opposite of today, where we parents can get a salad, but the kids can't. This was the opposite. The adult food was sort of the sophisticated stuff, but kids were being given a menu that was especially healthy. So it was like really wholesome soups and vegetable plates and sandwiches to reassure the mom that she could bring her kid to the restaurant. So I thought that was fascinating and also very upsetting when you kind of think about it. It's like in the old days, we felt like we really need to keep our kids in this sort of nutritional safe space until they're old enough to have junk food. And now it's kind of the opposite. We want to just throw the junk food at them on that menu to keep them quiet or to entertain them or to please them. And we're not really thinking about nutrition anymore. And I thought that was really fascinating.
I did too. I thought it was really interesting. And I guess now that leads me to the question, like, I think most of my listeners understand what, quote, today's kid food is, but I'm curious if you could define what kid food is and also how we got there. For what was it that, from the 1920s to the 1950s, we were making nutrition and healthy food options, a priority for children. And then all of a sudden now it's become what we view as kid food today.
So it's a great question. And I really came at it from a bunch of different angles. I actually did a survey of about 350 parents. Like, what do you think of as kid food? Just to get their answers. Of course, it's just what you're thinking: mac and cheese, chicken nuggets, fruit snacks, I did research on the grocery industry and what is considered kid food in the grocery market. And again, if you look at those products, and the responses of these parents, it's very consistent. What we consider kid food today is hyper palatable. It's almost always sort of simple carby food, lots of fat, sugar, salt. And then also there's always this element usually, brought in of like fun and excitement. So we have cartoon characters and games and bright colors. It's all sending kids a message that your food, unlike adult food, is always fun, always exciting, always like instantly delicious, very accessible. And I actually came across a survey. It was done in Canada, but I don't think it would be different here, where they actually asked kids, what do you think of as kid food versus adult food? And it was so depressing. Like, adult food was like fruits, vegetables, meat, and kid food was exactly what we're all thinking of. So it's really troubling, to be sending kids this message. And to answer your question, I mean, it's a pretty complex answer.
Yeah,
I
of
think
course.
from the 20s to today, so many things have happened. We've had this rise of the processed food industry. I think that's the hugest, the biggest driver of this phenomenon. They make more money when they can segment the market. So if you can just sell yogurt, but now you can sell kids yogurt, and you've got more shelf space in the grocery store. So I think that's the main driver. But I do point out, I think we have had some shifts in parenting also. I mean, and totally understandably, most families both parents are working. We are stressed and busy. And it's, I think parents have to some degree given up their role as nutritional gatekeepers just by necessity. They're tired and they want to get a quick meal on the table and they want to please everyone. And I think we've had a little bit of a breakdown in many cases of parents kind of holding the line on creating that nutritional safe space that we talked about.
Yeah, and I'm sure now parents are saying, well, how do I feed a picky eater? What do I do? And I will be bringing on, nutritionists to talk about this, but really, Bettina, for you, I want to talk really about like kind of how we got here and the policy around it. So if we have time, I absolutely want to dig into that. But with you, I really do want to talk. I have some like policy questions that I think help us also take off some of the responsibility sometimes, because I think sometimes we feel really responsible for those kind of things. And a lot of it sometimes is out of our control. And that's kind of what I want to focus on with you today.
I'm so glad, because that's really why I wrote the book, because I want not that parents don't have some responsibility, but I want them to understand this is hard for a reason, and it's not your fault, you know.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, it's true, because kid food, and I nannied between working for the Navy and starting the Wise Consumer podcast. I nannied, and so I don't have children yet of my own. I'm growing one right now, but I don't have my own.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I don't have children of my own, but I nannied, and I realized as I was reading your book, I was like, I fell into that trap, and I consider myself a healthy eater, but kids would want dinner, and by the end of the day, you've been running around, you going to the beach, coming home. You don't want to fight over chicken nuggets versus, like, okay, I'm going to make you a beet salad. Oh, beet salads are boring, Miss Maddie. And then they just don't eat. So, pick your battles. And I will bring on nutritionists to talk about this. But one of the things that I think is important to mention here when we're talking about convenience is the difference you shared between highly processed foods versus processed foods. And I think that actually is also really important when we're talking about all of this. So I would love for you to explain what the difference is and why it matters.
I'm so glad we're talking about this, because I would never say to parents, don't give your kids processed food. That's absurd. We all benefit from food processing. Food processing includes things like a can of black beans. And I don't know about you, but I'm not soaking beans all day.
Same.
Right. And so in so many ways, food processing has helped us eat more healthfully. Bagged salad greens are processed, and that is a huge time saver for families who can afford it. So absolutely not indicting quote unquote processed food. But yes, there is this category called ultra processed food, or in my book, I call it highly processed food. And that is something that unfortunately we do really need to pay attention to. There's a researcher named Carlos Monteiro in Brazil, and he's the one who came up with this kind of classification system. And I'll just go through it really quickly, but he basically divides all foods into 4 categories. So the first is unprocessed or minimally processed. So that would just be a carrot or a washed carrot or your bagged salad or your frozen produce. Obviously, that's all great. The second group is what he calls processed culinary ingredients. So these are things like butter, salt, fat, that are fine to the extent we're just using them to make the first category of foods taste better. If you want to put some butter and salt on your carrot, that's not an issue. That's how people have been eating for thousands of years. That's fine. Then we talk about processed food, and that is things that are like preserved, pickled, fermented. So those are things like the canned tomato, the cheese. Again, totally fine. The last category is where we get into trouble, and this is really what big food is selling, and it's called ultra processed food. It's where you're using a huge amount of the sugar, the oil, the simple starches. And these are foods that typically have 5 or more ingredients, and they typically have ingredients that themselves are ultra processed, like, stuff you'd never find in your kitchen, like soy protein isolate, stuff like that. And so you might be thinking, well, look, that's most of the supermarket, and what's the problem? And originally when Monteiro came out with this classification, I think a lot of researchers were skeptical. Like, he also built some other things into the definition, like ultra processed food is heavily advertised, super convenient, just takes us away from all those other healthier categories. And I think some people thought like he sort of created this category, but how do we know it's really problematic? Well, since he had done that, there have been these really powerful, huge population studies where there is now a very clear correlation established between ultra processed food consumption and all kinds of diseases, putting aside obesity, cancer, heart disease, irritable bowel, just early death. And I'm talking about studies that show a 10% increase in ultra processed food, it creates a 10% increase in risk of cancer. I mean, it's really troubling.
Yeah.
And we have studies that show that ultra processed food, without question, drives overeating. When we're given an ultra processed diet, we just eat more. So for all of those reasons, we really need to pay attention to this category of food. And there was a study literally just last week that determined that 2/3 of American kids and teens diets are now coming from ultra processed foods. So it is a serious issue, and unfortunately one that we can't just ignore as much as we might want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get to some of the quote solutions that we are working around, but I think one of also the contributing factors that you write about in your book is immersive advertising. Like 2/3 of the population, especially kids, are wanting these foods, eating these foods, and I think we can't, and like one of the panels, I think what was her name, Marion Nestle shared. Nestle, I may have pronounced
Nestle, yes.
Nestle shares, it's not like, and I want to mention this. It's not like I want people to think like, oh, well, all food industries are just bad guys who are trying to make our kids fat. They're trying to make us sick. Like, I don't think that's the case.
No, I'm flattered you watched that panel. It was a great discussion. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because someone in the panel said, this is evil, the way food companies are marketing to children. And she said, they're not evil. They're a business and they're trying to, they're profit motivated. And I thought that was an important point. I don't think that men and women, in these industries, I was in that industry, are evil, but they are allowed to market to children, and they continue to do so. And right, so you mentioned immersive marketing, and what I mean by that is just, in the old days, in my childhood, like a sugary cereal ad would be a 30-second spot on a cartoon. Now, that alone is not benign. There's really solid, well-established research that kids under 4 don't even know they're being advertised to. They just look at that sugary cereal ad and it looks to them like part of the cartoon, and they just soak it up. Yeah. Even older kids who understand that they're being advertised to, they still don't get that the advertiser might not have their best interest in mind. Like, they're still very naive and very vulnerable. And then even teens, and this is where we get into immersive marketing, even they are very susceptible to junk food advertising. And there are all kinds of studies about this. Like, if they see an influencer in their Instagram feed pushing a particular food, they may not realize it's advertising, because it's very often it's not disclosed. And when it is, it's very subtly disclosed. And there have been studies that they'll see an influencer in their Instagram feed, eating junk food, and then their eating behavior changes after that exposure. Mm-hmm. So, one of my main issues that I talk about in the book that I feel very passionately about is that we really should be banning the advertising of junk food to kids, certainly under 13, and I would say even under 18. But little kids for sure are very vulnerable.
Yeah. And I think there was, in that same panel, but even as a nanny, I remember like cereal boxes having, Frozen, Elsa and Anna on it, or, Baby Shark. I Googled when one of the panelists said like, oh, well, there's Baby Shark cereal. And I was like mortified, and I looked at the ingredients, and it's all highly processed foods, ultra processed, and advertising. And when you're in a grocery aisle, the nagging factor where kids see that, mommy, I want, or your daddy, whoever your guardian is, it's just, it makes it so much more challenging for parents.
Exactly. There's literally a term for it. They call it pester power, and they know how effective it is. There's a reason why they're paying Disney to put the character on the box, because they want that child to see it in the supermarket and start nagging their parents, because they absolutely know that will eventually wear you down. And it does. I remember going through the supermarket with my kids, and you say no 16 times, but the 17th time you're like, oh, let's just put it in the cart. And that's what they're banking on. Yeah,
absolutely. Another issue, so we're like jumping from issue to issue, but I just want to give my listener kind of a big picture here, because a lot of them I'm almost 90% guarantee that most of them aren't familiar with this. KidVid in the 1970s. This was like, so I think we started realizing, if I understand, like there were some issues, and I'd love for you to explain what KidVid was and what the FTC tried to do and the backlash and where that led us.
Absolutely. I was really interested in this too. I think I was vaguely aware of this effort, but really didn't know much about it until I wrote the book. So, right. So in the late 1970s, we already had this research that young kids, can't appropriately, understand advertising, that they're very vulnerable. So that was already there. And then in the late 1970s, the big issue was dental cavities from sugar, which now, not to like belittle dental cavities, but we have such bigger problems. But, but that was like the issue, like these super sugary cereals, kids getting cavities. And so the FTC started this effort, which came to be known as KidVid, to seriously limit or ban children's food marketing. And I think they felt very confident about it. There were polls that showed parents supported it. The medical community, the dental community was behind it. I think they thought this is going to be kind of a no-brainer. We're going to get this done. And it was really like such a powerful demonstration of the power of industry, the food industry, the beverage industry, the television networks, the advertising industry, all of those industries that were going to really suffer financially if that had happened, just, grouped together, put a huge amount of money into the lobbying effort and just crushed it, and it was really like an early example of this kind of nanny state messaging, instead of parents being sort of relieved and protected by this ban on predatory advertising, they were sort of pitching it to parents like, the nanny state's interfering with your family, which is so bizarre when you think about it, but it was effective and it crushed it. And really ever since then, the FTC, they've tried to do voluntary efforts, but they've never again gone down that road and probably won't. And what it led to was eventually well, I'm skipping a step. So then there's, when childhood obesity really started to become an issue in the early 2000s, the industry, to prevent anything like that from happening again, formed what's called the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. And it's an ongoing voluntary effort to regulate their advertising, but it's pretty toothless when you look at it carefully.
Why is that? Because I thought that was really interesting. Why is it, do you say toothless? Yeah.
So what they do is they set their own standard for what foods are considered essentially healthy and can be advertised to kids. And while it is true that they have tightened that standard periodically over the years, I just looked at the current product list because I knew we'd be talking about it. And here are some examples: Lucky Charms, Trix, Pop-Tarts, Lunchables, flavored blasted goldfish. Those are all considered healthy foods that still can be advertised to children. So I think most parents listening are thinking, well, thanks, but we haven't really made a tremendous amount of progress if that's the bar, the limit.
I mean, when you think about a whole food, okay, let's think of an apple. Like that's what most of us and most kids would probably think that's a healthy food. And then on their list is Lucky Charms. Like, you guys, I am going to, in your show notes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the ingredients and because I think when you think of like Kool-Aid, Lucky Charms, Fruit Loops, like these are quote healthy foods that just really irritates me. And I think, it is kind of a losing battle. If that's what they're saying is healthy food and that's what they're advertising, as parents, we're just like, oh my gosh.
Exactly. And what they'll do is they'll create like one or two Lunchables that meet the healthy standard. But then the kids just seeing an ad for a Lunchable, they're not making the distinction. Well, it's not the pepperoni pizza one, it's the turkey one, So it's very clever. And look, I think we have to step back again, going back to what we were talking about with Mary Nussel. They're a for-profit industry. Yeah. They're not going to create their own voluntary guidelines that put themselves out of business, So the bottom line is, unless parents and politicians can overcome the force of food industry lobbying and demand it, it's never going to happen through voluntary self-regulation, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're not going to have the food brand creating Lucky Charms be like all of a sudden say like, actually, don't eat Lucky Charms. We highly recommend you eat Quaker Oats oatmeal with like a little bit of dash of cinnamon. Don't buy her products. And that's why I really liked what she said, because they are for profit. They're just a business like any other business trying to make it, and unfortunately, our children sometimes are at the flip side of that, and suffering from some of
Exactly.
that. And I think like
Absolutely.
as caretakers, that's where I think this knowledge and why I wanted to bring you on. It's like if we know this, because once in a while, I want to make sure everyone knows. Once in a while, it's okay to eat Lucky Charms. It's okay to have Lunchables. You're in a pinch, but like what the problem, the challenge is when this becomes your everyday norm. Um, I want to flip a little bit ahead here from where I had originally, planned it in my conversation, but I think this leads to some of the challenges that are really heartbreaking to me and most of my listeners when you think of food insecurity, because you can't talk about these issues without talking about food insecurity and the challenges. Like if someone can't eat anything and all they can have is a Lunchable, who am I to say like, well, that is unhealthy. You should just, they need to eat.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. Right. I mean, I'm always conscious of the privilege of talking about avoiding some of these foods because, as you said, they are often cheaper on a calorie per dollar basis to buy a highly processed food. Of course, there's this issue of convenience. People
yeah,
don't have time
right.
or the facilities in their house to cook. I mean, I get that completely. So I'm always very aware of that. And that's one reason why I'm very concerned about ultra processed food in school meals,
Yeah.
because school meals are a huge safety net for children on free and reduced price lunch. And yet, for all kinds of reasons I talk about in the book, despite the Obama era reforms, which have greatly improved the nutrition standards, those nutrition standards are still being kind of interpreted through ultra processed food in many schools, I would say most school districts. And so that's an issue I think we really need to be thinking about and talking about.
Yeah, and I'm curious, you do talk about school lunches, and I think this is an important thing because I think it's like 11 million to 13 million children right now are food insecure. 80% of them, I think you shared, depend on school lunches. And so it's just really heartbreaking to me when they go to school and instead of getting like a nutritious meal, they end up getting what, you write as carnival food or kid food, like pizza, chicken nuggets, etc. So, but it is complex. It's not like an easy fix for schools to have healthy lunches. So I'd love for you to explore that a little bit.
Absolutely. So just to be clear, you know, school food, they just did this really interesting survey about like where people's calories are coming from. And they determined that like actually the healthiest place right now to be eating is schools. So
Really?
kids are it's sort of it's a nuanced issue. Like in terms of like actually checking off the nutrient boxes,
Mm-hmm.
kids are getting healthy food in school,
Good.
and it is they do have to get fruits or vegetables at lunch. There have been all these kinds of changes through the
Good.
Obama
Uh-huh.
reforms that are really important, and I don't mean to like in any way minimize that, because that is a huge leap forward. But right, it is coming through ultra processed food often, and it is coming through, just as you call it, like carnival food or kid food. And there are all kinds of reasons why districts feel like they have to stick to these menus that are like the pizza and the corn dog. And I go into them in the book. I don't want to belabor it too much, but one of the main issues is inadequate funding. I
Yep.
mean, schools are given just a tiny bit of money per child per meal, and once you factor out the labor, which in some communities can be very high, and the overhead and all of that, they're left usually with about $1 per child per meal for the food. So that is really challenging. And again, this issue of labor, like if you can't pay skilled labor to scratch cook, and if you don't have like a kitchen in which they can scratch cook, it's so much more cost effective for you to take your raw commodity chicken and just send it to Tyson and have it made into nuggets.
Yeah.
So I would say, inadequate funding is a huge issue
Yeah.
driving the those kinds of menus and the lack of kind of fresher scratch cooked food that we'd love to see nationwide. I mean, some districts are doing it, but it's still, I would say, not the norm.
Yeah, I think I had seen the Jamie Oliver show where he went into school lunches too, and I got a sense of that. Like, well, I hesitate bringing this up too, but one of the things that I also noticed in that show and things that I've read is, and being a nanny, if you do create these healthy foods, children aren't necessarily used to eating these healthy foods and don't necessarily want these foods.
Exactly. That is real. I am so sympathetic to school nutrition directors because they're competing with the food that might be around the campus. They might be offering food that kids have never seen before, and we all know. I mean, as you'll learn with your new baby, kids can be very reluctant to try something that they've never seen, and you don't want that food going in the trash can. So they're always walking that line of like How do we attract kids in the cafeteria, or the kids who are there? How do we make sure they don't toss the food? And I will say there are districts doing a really amazing job. Like they do sampling, they involve, which is great because the kid doesn't want to commit to taking an entree, but if they can sample it, then they might say, oh, that's pretty good. They involve kids in creating the menu. I think a huge issue is the lack of food and nutrition education in schools. Like you can't ask the cafeteria to be doing something that is not supported in any other way. So I agree that is a huge challenge, and not one that I minimize in any way.
Yeah, what's also really interesting to me as I was exploring this and I'm looking into child nutrition for part of the work that I'm doing, I'm French American. So one of the things that I was raised eating very differently than a lot of my peers at school were. So I realized like your household where you come from, it does impact, what you view as quote kid food versus, what others may view as kid food. But I did research to see what do French menus have on their menus. I don't know if you've explored this at all.
Yes, I have. It's amazing.
And this is like one of the things that I really am curious. Maybe you can answer it. I don't know if you can. Like, how is it that like in France and my husband is like, don't be so poo-poo about this kind of stuff. Like you're not like some posh French person. But so I want to preface that it's not what I'm saying here, but like, how is it that in France we can serve children, I don't know, like mushrooms and they have fish and they have all of these meals that like most American children wouldn't consider eating. And it's just really interesting to me.
Such a good question. So I don't know if you remember, Michael Moore had this movie called Where to Invade Next. It was like several years ago. And he looks at different countries and like what they're doing better than America. And in France, he chose school food. And when that movie came out, I actually got kind of angry because there was a lot of mockery of American school meals in comparison to these amazing French meals, but without explaining why there's such a difference. And so I actually wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about this because I was so fired up. So I'm very qualified to answer this question.
Oh,
so
great.
Really, I think you have to look at so many factors and then see how we are hindering our own school meal program. So number one is money, going back to just what we were talking about.
Yeah.
I can't tell you now the exact figures, but the funding in France is so much higher. It's on a sliding scale. Obviously less well-off parents are paying less, but they are getting so much more money for school, relatively speaking, than American kids, American school meal programs. So you could just stop right there. I mean, they can serve things we simply can't afford. Then, they do things that would just never fly in America. You're not supposed to bring your own lunch to a French school. And that's actually become kind of controversial around, Muslim kids who might need halal food and stuff like that. But again, if you could say that in America, like, look, we're all eating the same meal. We're all going to sit down to the same meal and break bread together. And you're not bringing your Lunchable. We're all going to eat this fish. That would change things a lot. But we of course, that's never going to happen in this country culturally.
Yeah.
And then, of course, France has this like venerated food culture that they, historically, that they still actively try to preserve. I mean, I think they're struggling, but they do things like taste training of little kids in preschool, to kind of expand their palates. So there's so many things going on in the French culture that support these kinds of school meals. Like they eat on plates with cutlery. They have like a long time to eat. Things that just in America, we don't value, and therefore they're not reflected in our meal system. So it's a great question. I mean, it's very easy to look at these other countries and say, why can't we do that here? But it kind of reveals the ways in which we're really hobbled in this country.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I went to school in Belgium for 2 years. And I remember we could walk home and have lunch with my mom at home. And then we would walk back to school. We'd have like an hour and a half sometimes off for lunch. When I remember coming back to high school here, I mean, I could go home when I was in California. I was allowed to go home, but we had like 30 minutes. Like, so if you wanted to go home, it's like, you better bike fast.
It's like inhumane how little time some kids are getting in this country. Like they might get a half-hour lunch period, but by the time they get through the line and sit down, they have like 10 minutes to scarf their food. And not only is that terrible for their digestion and they don't get to socialize, and they don't get to relax, there are actually studies that show their nutritional intake is compromised. Like the fruits and vegetables tend to be the last to be eaten, So it's really, that is such a troubling issue that we don't give kids enough time to eat. It's it's something that I think parents are very concerned about. And I talk about in the book some, ways we can try to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad I asked that question. I almost didn't because I never want, for everyone listening, I never want people to think like, as someone who was raised maybe in like a Franco-American culture, like, oh, we eat so much better, because we don't. And there are challenges in France. I will tell you, there are just, it is rising. Like the obesity rate is also rising. So it's not perfect. It was just something that as I was working on, my child nutrition program with my colleague, I was just nerding out, and I thought I would find the differences between this. But
yes, I'm glad you brought it up.
yeah, same. And another country. So this was really interesting. You mentioned in your book Chile. I think it was like law 20,606. I don't know what they actually call it. I would love for you to talk about what Chile did and whether or not that law had some positive outcomes.
So, right. So there are countries around the world now that are so concerned about childhood obesity, rightfully so, given the rates, and so concerned about the kind of outsized influence of big food on their children and on their diets, that they are getting really aggressive in fighting back. And so Chile was the first to put they're like these black hexagon warning labels. And it's funny, I was just in Mexico last week, and Mexico has the exact same label. And it was really interesting to see it in practice. I'll just give you an example. I was in the airport in Mexico at a Starbucks, and I saw this like this new drink I'd never seen before, and I was going to reach for it because I thought it might just be like a flavored seltzer. And there was the big hexagon saying lots of sugar, in Spanish. Really? And I was like, oh, that's not the drink I thought it was. So it's very effective. So they have these warning labels on products. And then the other thing is they've absolutely banned advertising to children, down to you can't have Tony the Tiger on the Frosted Flakes box. They take it off in Chile. They have to have a different box, Now, is this working? Is it changing things? I think it's too early to say. I can't remember the exact year, but this only recently went into effect. But I just read last week kind of a check-in on what's going on there. And one thing that I've read actually in multiple places is that kids are very attuned to those warning labels and will actually, this is anecdotal, but I've seen it in a lot of places, they'll actually tell their parents, don't put that in the cart because, and they've learned about the warning labels in school. So it's really, it's very encouraging to see this kind of stuff going on around the world. The UK just passed a law a few weeks ago, I think, or it's, at any rate, it's going to go into effect next year, where you cannot advertise unhealthy foods and drinks on television before 9 p.m. because they just don't want kids to see that. Right. And you can't advertise it anywhere on the internet. So that these are like bold policies that we're starting to see. And I'm very encouraged, and hopefully, our own country can follow suit.
That's really interesting. And I want to say too, I think we don't give our kids enough credit, because hearing you say, like, sometimes kids will be like, we shouldn't eat that. And kids are smart, they're smart, they know. And I think if we can take some of that away and educate them around that as well, I think a lot could change over time.
Absolutely, because going back to advertising is hugely powerful. They've done studies that kids can form brand loyalties or, strong interest in a product after one commercial exposure. And the food and beverage industry is spending, we think, $2 billion a year just to advertise unhealthy foods and drinks to your kids, which is like literally like $250,000 every hour or something like that. So this is such a powerful educational force on your children that if we could remove that, it could have a very profound impact, I think, on our children's diets. They are influenced by what they see, and what they see is being driven by this, $2 billion effort every year.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And another thing that, as I was like preparing for this conversation and researching, that I noticed is very similar in the food. It's not just the food industry when we're talking about these things. If you think, it's also the product labeling on, our skincare products, the fashion, you mentioned fruit washing, and immediately I thought of like the greenwashing issue that we have here, where it's like the food industry it's not just the food industry, everyone. It's like everyone's just trying to make a bang for the buck.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, the fruit washing and the veggie washing. I think that's, what I talk about in the book is the food industry has like what I call a divide and conquer strategy. So while they're deluging your kids with, Elsa from Frozen and all of that stuff, and trying to get your kids to pester you in the store and want the product, they're doing a lot of things to confuse parents about the nutritional value of the product so that the parent can feel okay saying, okay, throw the cereal in the cart.
Mm-hmm.
So it's lots of claims about, contains whole grains, made with kale, made with real fruit. And I have almost like a field guide in the book, like one chapter where I just break down for you. Here's what's really going on when they say made with real fruit. Here's really what's going on when they talk about the kale in the product, because that stuff influences parents. I fell for a lot of those claims when my kids were little. You want to fall for the claim because it's so much easier to get your kids to eat the kale puff than a piece of kale. So of course you want to believe. And so I talk about ways we could, rein them in a little bit on those claims.
Rein it in on a policy level or as an individual?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, it's both. I want parents to be empowered, and that's why I have literally like kind of a field guide. Like, here's how you can decode what you're looking at. But yes, I think, and I have some very specific proposals in the book, that we should be tweaking marketing regulations so that they can't make claims like that. Like, you cannot be talking about kale and putting kale on the box, picture, unless you have a meaningful amount of kale. And I actually am part of this coalition. I'm so proud of the work. It's the Partnership for Healthier America. They have a program called Veggies Early and Often, because there's all this research now that if you can get babies during this quote unquote flavor window to acclimate to vegetables, it really shapes their palate for a lifetime. But too many baby and toddler products are saying they have veggies, but they don't really accomplish that goal. So Veggies Early and Often is this like sort of almost like a certification program where you can't make those veggie claims unless you really have a real amount of veggies in there, and then you can have a special logo. And I think it's fantastic, and there are a lot of companies now participating.
I love that. What is it called? Veggies Early and Often. I'm gonna look
into that. Veggies Early and Often, and I've written about it. And so like baby food companies that are, or especially toddler foods, they're offering like pre-made toddler meals, which are so convenient, but aren't often the greatest quality. And you can sort of trust this logo when you see it in the supermarket.
Yeah, I love that, because in your book, you even mentioned like number one, pediatrician recommended. And as a consumer, when I were, if I wasn't such a nerd about these kind of things, I'd be like, oh, okay, poof, put it in the cart,
Right.
So, and this is why, again, it goes back to, it is challenging for parents. It's not always straightforward.
Oh, it's incredibly challenging for parents. It's like walking a minefield. I mean, you've got your kid pumped up and nagging you, and you want to get a meal on the table, and you're tired and you don't want to argue with anyone, and they're telling you it has kale. It's a perfect storm for you to be like, I'll just put the kale chips in. And when I say kale chip, I'm talking about like those potato puffs.
Oh yeah, like veggie sticks,
a little green.
Yeah,
exactly right.
The pouches and
right. So I am so not judgmental of parents. Like I said, I fell into these traps all the time too, and who wouldn't, and so I'm trying to talk about how can we change the external environment so that your job becomes easier. That's what I want.
Yeah, I brought on the Zero Waste Chef and the Zero Waste Chef and a few other zero waste influencers to chat about this, because you think like, oh well, then if you're not going to be making pouches, then you buy pouches, or if you're not buying pouches, then you make food. But let me tell you, my listener is a busy woman. Most likely, most of my listener is women, are women who are not necessarily going to be spending their limited time on a Sunday evening after they've done like basketball practice, soccer practice, violin lessons, blah blah. Pre-COVID, of course. And then all of a sudden be like, and now I'm going to go ahead and puree all the vegetables and make, so it's like, I understand why pouches and things. And that's why it's frustrating to me, because it is about convenience. And then if you're like picking something that's filled with sugar, you're giving that to your kids instead of making it yourself. It's like a lose-lose.
Right. And that's why I love these like industry initiatives like the Veggies Early and Often, where it's like, we get that you need the pre-made meal. Here it is, and you can truly trust it because we have set a very high standard, and so that's voluntary and industry driven, and I think awesome. But again, if we could shape regulations so that you would be very clearly warned about the amount of sugar in something, or they can't make the veggie claim unless that kind of stuff. Then you can rely on this convenience, but really feel good about it. And I think that's an ultimate goal, because I understand you're busy or you're financially unable or whatever. Right. It's a burden. I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you mentioning the veggie early and often because I think that's great. We're getting close to your hour, which I just really appreciate this conversation. And before I ask my final two questions for you, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think would be really important to share, or, policy or something like that that you'd like to share with my listeners?
Well, I mean, I think you asked such great questions. I don't really think we've missed anything. I guess I would just say that, you know, I want parents to understand that, I wrote this book with the greatest sense of empathy for the struggles that parents face today, and that I hope my goal is to make things easier for them, to be more informed, to be empowered. And then, one thing we haven't talked about, and these days with COVID, I'm even hesitant to bring it up, but, I wrote the book literally just pre-COVID. When our lives get back to normal, one thing that I do feel really strongly in is the power of parents. I mean, we need government, we need industry, but parents too have a role to play. And so I talk about ways that parents, if they're motivated, can make change themselves, whether it's something really small, like I'd like my teacher to stop handing out candy rewards. How do I tackle that? Or I'd really like the soccer coach to say, let's all have water instead of Gatorade. What's the best way to approach that? Or I'm fired up. I want to lobby Congress. I want parents to feel empowered. And that was another reason why I wrote the book. I do offer one chapter specifically devoted to advocacy, if that floats your boat. And I get it that a lot of parents are like, you know what, I'm busy. But if you're motivated, I want to help them in that way too. Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of my guests when it comes to, you're talking about climate change, you're talking about ethical fashion, you're talking about all like plastic waste, plastic pollution. At the end of the day, there's, we often think like, well, and that was like one of my final questions. We think it's like all doom and gloom and we can't do anything. But on a positive note, as individuals, as citizens, there are small things that we can do. And while it may seem small, it actually can go quite the distance.
Absolutely. I truly believe that. I've done it in my own life, even though I'm the last person in the world who thought of herself as like an activist or advocate. That wasn't how I saw myself. And yet I've been able to make some changes. And I think, and I've talked to other parents who've done so and gotten their tips, and I tell you my mistakes. And, I want people to feel like, yes, you can make a difference too, in your own child's life. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I really like your book because your book really is non-judgmental. It's really facts and information that I think really empowers us. Like, I'm really happy I read this book before I brought my child into this world, because now I'm like much more aware and I can make more conscious decisions when I'm, whatever it is, I'm out and about, traveling, wherever, and also I do believe in the power of reaching out to my local representatives and or getting involved with the school teachers and saying like, hey, let's try to do, I have no problem being that parent at some point. To help if someone else is too busy, to do that in the schoolroom. I get that. So I really want to empower everyone to take this book and just flip through it even, and you'll get some good information. My second to last question for you though is, what positive changes have you seen since you've started this? Because it isn't all doom and gloom.
It's not all doom and gloom. I feel, well, one thing, are the efforts we talked about, around the world going on. That's very encouraging to me. Big food is powerful here, but it's powerful in other countries too. And yet I'm seeing governments and I'm seeing societies overcome that influence and get really substantive legislation passed. That's been very encouraging. I think these issues are much more on the radar. I think parents are much more attuned now. For example, like sugar, I think when I was raising my kids early on, obviously I knew like too much sugar was bad, but we didn't have like a good guideline on like how much is added sugar is too much. I think we have much better research on that. I think obviously school food has greatly improved since I first became involved in this issue, and that's enormously important. I definitely feel like we're moving in the right direction, and yet we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, we do. Like in any industry, honestly, that, when I talk to guests or explore topics, when it comes again to like ethical fashion, plastic pollution, we do have a ways to go, but I'm encouraged by more and more people getting, involved and wanting to move the needle forward in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Bettina, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Where can my listeners connect with you? Where can they get access to your amazing Substack, I want to say, your newsletter, et cetera?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, you can find me on social media, under the lunch tray on Twitter, Bettina Siegel on Instagram. I'm on Facebook as the Lunch Tray. And then, yes, I just this year converted my blog into a Substack newsletter. And if you want to try it out for free, just sign up and you'll get 4 free issues. You can check out the whole archive and see if it's for you. And basically, my goal every week is to give you kind of an overview of literally all the kids' food news in the prior week. And every week, I'm amazed at how much there is. And I hope it's useful for people.
Yeah, I really want to acknowledge you for the work you're doing and thank you for the work you're doing because I love your newsletter. And yes, maybe I am more, nerding out about this kind of stuff, but I do highly recommend it for people because if you don't have time necessarily to get involved, at least you can be aware of what's happening and where the ball is being moved in what direction. So thank you so much for the work you're doing for your book. I love it. Highly recommend everyone, please check out her book. I will link it in the show notes. And Bettina, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. I was really honored to be on your show. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, friend, that about wraps it up, but this convo does not have to end here. I would love to hear from you, so please send your questions and comments my way. And if there's a topic you want to hear more about, send me a DM on Instagram at @TheWiseConsumer or email me at hello@thewiseconsumer.com and let's chat. In the meantime, could I ask you to do me a huge favor, please? I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes out of your day to subscribe to my show and leave me a review if you haven't already. You can do so in the iTunes app. It's that purple icon that comes preloaded on most smartphones, but I've also linked it up in the show notes if you're not sure how to access it. Anyway, that wraps it up for today. So until next time, friend, be safe, stay healthy, and take care. Hi, friends. As always, just ending this episode with my obligatory disclaimer. Please remember, the wise consumer is intended for educational purposes only. The content being shared here should not be used as a substitute for professional care by your healthcare provider. I am not a qualified medical expert, nor do I pretend to be, so please note that the content and research I share and explore on this podcast is not intended to treat or diagnose you. If you have any medical questions, concerns, or wish to make changes to your diet, please speak to your physician or any qualified healthcare professional for that matter. The wise consumer may not be held responsible for your health, dietary, or lifestyle decisions. I am simply here to encourage you to seek healthier, more eco-friendly, and conscious alternatives. While the Wise Consumer podcast offers information from many sources, the opinions expressed are solely those of the Wise Consumer and not those of any affiliate or other entity. Additionally, while I always do my best to source and research the most up-to-date and accurate information, I realize science is continually evolving. If you come across any scientific information that is blatantly incorrect, please kindly email me at hello@thewiseconsumer.com. And finally, this podcast and any other offerings of The Wise Consumer may contain copyrighted material, the use of which has not always been specifically authorized by the copyright owner because it is being used for educational purposes. If you wish to use copyrighted material from this podcast or any other offerings of The Wise Consumer for purposes of your own that go beyond fair use, you must obtain permission from the copyright owner.